Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. This week, the coverage of the drone story. For the most part, it's not in print. It's off the air, out of sight, and out of mind. Hard feelings on Lebanese television over the coverage of the war in Syria. The newspaper that took down a president and got the Hollywood treatment struggles to remain relevant in the digital world, and crystal balling the future of technology.
With equipment like this in the home of the future, we may not have to go to work.
In our web video of the week. Within 3 days of taking office back in 2009, Barack Obama ordered his first drone strikes. The American president's targets were in Yemen, Somalia, and the tribal areas of Pakistan. In its early years, this supposedly covert program was among the worst-kept secrets of the Obama administration. People knew it was happening, but few were prepared to actually report on it. What has emerged over the past week has a lot more people talking. We've learned that some major American news outlets agreed to conceal newsworthy information they had on drones on the basis that reporting the truth would have harmed American national security interests. On the 5th of February, The Washington Post admitted that 2 years ago, the Obama administration established a drone base in Saudi Arabia, but the Post and other journalistic organizations kept a lid on that story at the administration's request. Given that we're talking about a program that has resulted in at least 300 and as many as 720 civilian deaths alone, 66 of which were children, is this not a story that American citizens need to know more about? Our starting point this week is Washington, D.C., the command center for a remote control war that is being fought, for the most part, in secret.
I want to make sure that people understand actually drones have not caused a huge number of civilian casualties.
This has been a slow ramping up of targeted killings and also a slow ramping up of the media coverage.
This is one of the most controversial and secretive policies of the Obama administration.
It's a secret program. It's all classified work. Reporters aren't welcome there.
Americans should have the opportunity to know more about these secret drone wars.
This information does intermittently appear. Whether major news organizations choose to pick up and run with those stories is a different matter.
There has to be a whole lot more open discussion.
It's a very, very serious journalistic issue that the media, to some extent, wasn't sure always how to handle it.
It was a case of breaking news that took a long time to break. On February 5th, The Washington Post and The New York Times both published a story they had been sitting on for months, news the Obama administration wanted to keep to itself. That for the past 2 years, American unmanned attack aircraft had been flying missions out of a base in Saudi Arabia.
It was a voluntary agreement between the big players, so we know for sure that the New York Times, The Washington Post, and Associated Press all knew the identity of the drone base in Saudi Arabia, but chose not to publish it after discussions with U.S. intelligence officials.
I wouldn't call it exactly a gag order. It was a request by the administration. And my newspaper, along with other newspapers, responds in different ways to those. The administration tends to invoke national security. Any media outlet's going to take that very seriously.
No American journalist or any journalist wants to be responsible for someone's death. On the other hand, the story of the Saudi base was such a broad story about what U.S. intelligence agencies were doing that it seemed important in a way that the revealing of a name doesn't seem important. So for that reason, it would have made sense to publish it, but they decided not to.
Each time, each organization was asked privately, separately, to withhold that information. Once the New York Times made a decision that they were now ready to go with it, that they were no longer going to continue to withhold the information, that also just shows you a little bit about competition. The administration can ask you to hold it and hold it and hold it, but once you find out there's a competitor who's ready to go, it doesn't matter how much you've promised in the past.
The revelation that America has a secret base in Saudi Arabia.
The presence of a drone base on Saudi territory is ultra-sensitive. The stationing of U.S. forces and warplanes in Saudi Arabia served as a clarion call for al-Qaeda in its formative days, and eventually led to the 1996 bombing in Khobar that killed 19 Americans. What concerns U.S. media watchers, however, is the pattern of cooperation American news outlets have with presidential administrations, and not just this one. In December 2005, the Times revealed details of the wiretapping of American citizens under the Bush administration conducted without warrants and in contravention of existing American law. It turns out the Times had that story for more than a year, but sat on it, again, at the request of the White House. Chris Woods is with the Bureau of Investigative Journalism, the BIJ, which has done extensive reporting on the drone program. As a UK-based organization, the BIJ is doing the kind of journalism on American national security issues that many US news outlets shy away from.
What's evolved in particularly the US media in recent years is a quite cozy relationship between the national intelligence apparatus and journalists reporting on those matters. And I think that puts many journalists, particularly in Washington, too close to the story. They are dependent in many ways on leaks and on information from intelligence figures, and they are often loath to challenge some pretty core facts.
Any media organization, particularly one that is, eager to solicit information from a government, plays a kind of constant game of cat and mouse with the government. You want to get as much information about them as you can, but you also, to some extent, you do favors for them and in the hopes of getting more. There's a constant back and forth with them, and I suppose to the extent that you want to do them a favor, you figure that it's worth doing to some extent.
It's not as though there's been no coverage of the drone program in the US media. In August 2011, Scott Shane of the New York Times wrote a piece questioning the administration's claims that the collateral damage, the civilian casualties, were minimal.
NBC News has obtained a government document that...
And what triggered both the Times and the Post to finally publish their stories on the Saudi drone base was a report from the day before, February 4th, by NBC's Michael Isikoff, that made news. Isikoff published a government paper that argued there was legal justification to kill an American citizen turned al-Qaeda cleric. Anwar al-Awlaki and his 16-year-old son were killed in Yemen in September 2011 in separate drone strikes.
The reason that American journalists focus on it is because an American had been killed. And in this way, it reflects sort of the overall sentiment about Americans and the drone program. As long as the strikes are taking place far away, Americans were pretty much okay with the program, and so are journalists. The moment that an American is targeted, journalists began to see the issue in a different way. So I think that says a lot about the drone program in general, and also about the American media.
Really, one of the other bigger issues here too is, what the bar is. Can the administration always claim, a national security threat or risk or vulnerability? It's very easy to say lives are at risk, but it's much harder to show that. News organizations need to be skeptical, need to listen to the concerns and considerations of the administration, but really need to be the independent voices of the public that they are and make appropriate decisions for what they believe needs to be public.
After the New York Times printed its drone story, the paper's ombudsperson, Margaret Sullivan, wrote about the decision to finally publish, which she agreed with. She talked about the undue secrecy surrounding the drone program, the lack of due process and accountability. However, on the larger issue for the paper, holding back the story at the administration's request, she limited her comment to, if it was ever appropriate to withhold the information, that time was over. As one of the readers' comments put it, isn't that really the question here? Why isn't the public editor addressing the real tough questions? Isn't that her job? But, as they say in New York, that's all she wrote. Our Global Village Voices now on the coverage of the drone story.
Real hypocrisy in this is that the media, particularly liberal media, was quite critical of the excesses of George W. Bush, and justifiably so. However, under Mr. Obama, they seem to have abdicated this duty, and in many of the most glaring cases have acted as outright apologists.
Journalists face many challenges when attempting to obtain information from the United States government. Essentially, the government can claim whenever a direct question is asked that the program is far too secretive to either confirm or deny, and we are simply left to our own devices and to anonymous sources who selectively leak information.
The most vital and truthful reporting on the drone policies, its rampant criminality, the murder of countless men, women, and children, including American citizens, has come from well outside of the mainstream, from organizations such as the Bureau of Investigative Journalism. It's these voices, rather than the mainstream media, that need to be heard and amplified.
Time now for Listening Post News Bites. Here's a postscript from last week's report on cyber warfare, which focused on China. The latest targets of such attacks are reporters covering Myanmar. At least 12 journalists there have been informed by Google that their email accounts have been hacked into. The reporters work for various outlets, including the Myanmar-based 11 Media Group, the Voice Weekly newspaper, as well as international organizations such as AP and Reuters. Google has not revealed exactly who was behind the attacks, but did say that they were state-sponsored. Analysts are speculating that the hacks were provoked by some news coverage of the ethnic conflict in the northern state of Kachin. Yangon has officially denied any involvement and called on Google to identify the real perpetrators. The government has also said that it's been victimized by an attack on the president's own website. On a more positive note from Myanmar, as of April, foreign reporters will be offered working visas there, but journalists based in the country are still waiting for the new media law that the government promised by the end of 2012, but has yet to deliver. Lebanese television viewers just got an illustrative example of the hard feelings in Lebanon over the war in Syria and the role that the media are playing in that story. It came on a talk show on Al Manar, the Beirut-based Hezbollah-funded channel. It was supposed to be a debate between Salam Zahrani, the head of a Lebanese media center and a supporter of the Assad government, and Assad Bashara, a journalist with Al Jumahariya in Lebanon who opposes the government in Damascus. As things heated up, they started arguing about media bias. Zahrani then called Bashara an idiot who collaborates with Israel, and before the host could intervene, doused his debate opponent with water. Time, the producers decided, to cut to commercial. Journalists are supposedly trained to check their sources and ideally have more than one to go on. Here's what can happen when they fail to do that. On February 12th, Susie Parker, a reporter for the Washington Post, wrote a piece on former Alaska Governor Sarah Palin and reported that she'd be joining the new Al Jazeera America network, which is expected to launch later this year. Parker included a quote from a website called The Daily Current, which had Palin saying, "As you all know, I'm not a big fan of newspapers, journalists, news anchors, and the liberal media in general, but I met with the folks at Al Jazeera, and they told me they reach millions of devoutly religious people who don't watch CBS or CNN. That tells me they don't have a liberal bias." The problem lay in the title of the website that the story came from. That's Current with an A. It's a satirical site known for headlines like "Mugabe bans the color white" and "Vladimir Putin kills bear with bare hands." The Palin story was fiction. The Post issued a correction, and Palin tweeted, "Hey, Washington Post, I'm having coffee with Elvis this week. He works at the Mocha Moose in Wasilla." That's Sarah Palin's hometown in Alaska. When we at the Listening Post do a piece on the state of American journalism, as we just did with the coverage of the drone story, somebody always laments that things have changed since the halcyon days of U.S. newspaper reporting. And they inevitably bring up Watergate, the bungled burglary of a Democratic Party office in Washington that set into motion one of the most infamous political scandals of all time. Watergate led to the downfall of a president, Richard Nixon, made stars of two reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, set a new standard for investigative reporting, and sent thousands of young Americans stampeding into journalism schools. The Washington Post managed to make journalism trendy. Times have changed. 2 decades ago, the paper sold 830,000 copies a day. Now that figure is at less than 500,000, and circulation has dropped by 8% over the past year. The Post isn't the only paper struggling in the era of the World Wide Web, but few publications have fallen from such a height. The Listening Post's Marcela Pizarro now on a legendary newspaper going through some hard times. The nostalgia in Washington for the Post's past glories, and the challenges for investigative journalism in the digital age.
On June 18, 1972, the Washington Post ran a front-page story, a story that would shake up American politics.
Well, when the president does it, that means that it is not illegal.
That would eventually bring down Richard Nixon.
I shall resign the presidency effective at noon tomorrow.
And catapult the Washington Post into the national, even global spotlight.
The notion of the Washington Post as that entity And as that force in American journalism, it entirely changed the way people thought about what journalists could actually achieve.
It put the Washington Post on the map. It made it nationally prominent when it hadn't been prominent previously. So it really was a watershed moment.
Almost no other paper enjoyed the glory the Washington Post did during its heyday. Editor Ben Bradlee and reporters Carl Bernstein and Bob Woodward all became legends of their times. The Post was featured in the film All the President's Men, which showed the reporters doing many things it's criticized for not doing today. For instance, having an editor willing to commit 2 journalists for 2 years to a single story and refusing to bow to political pressure.
Get some harder information next time.
I don't see the kind of reporting projects that come out that really sock you between the eyes and that you're rushing to get your newspaper, and you don't have these really blood feuds going on with the administrations in power. And so it leads people to conclude that everybody in Washington is in bed with everybody else.
Today's Washington Post is a much more fearful place than the Washington Post of 40 years ago. Today's Washington Post doesn't have a Ben Bradlee who didn't care what the White House wanted. What we've seen over the last decade especially is a Washington Post that tends to be less courageous in calling it like it sees it.
There is also a change in this value of that kind of reporting. It's seen as old school, very old-fashioned. Lots of people who are coming to the media today and doing incisive commentary and analysis, but it seems more impossible for people to sort of dig in to these long-term projects.
The Post of recent times bears little resemblance to what it was then. Dan Frumkin spent 6 years at the paper and was critical of the Bush administration. Early in the Obama era, management said his blog wasn't, quote-unquote, working anymore.
During that period, it seemed obvious to me that there was a lot of stuff coming out of the White House that was misinformation and lies. And I was a contractor. I worked at home. I was sort of immune from the political pressure of the Washington Post newsroom. There was something about the corporate structure of the newspaper, of the modern Washington Post, that didn't let them write the stories that they should have.
The Post's had some journalistic triumphs. Barton Gellman's reporting on Dick Cheney's time in office, Dana Priest's exposing the US intelligence apparatus, and James Grimaldi won a Pulitzer in 2006. His reporting on the Abramoff lobbying scandal had some powerful people in Washington running for cover. Grimaldi, though, is part of a shrinking investigative team. He recently took a buyout and is heading for the Wall Street Journal, but still says the Post is a quality newspaper.
The rumors of investigative reporting's death is greatly exaggerated, as Mark Twain once said. In fact, the Post in particular still has a very active investigative unit and has investigative reporters throughout the newsroom, and it's an important part of its mission.
There are pockets of great reporting that the paper still puts out in that old school style. The problem that the Post has had is that they have been cutting away at their newsroom, and it has just created a newspaper that's focused much more on the shrinking size of its own workforce than it is on doing some of those really in-depth and investigative projects.
Every newspaper in the country is facing that kind of challenge because the resources are not what they were, the advertising revenue is not what it was, and investigative reporters have always had a hard time justifying their existence because sometimes they work for weeks or months on something and it doesn't pay off.
Investigative journalism is changing. The print industry may be getting smaller, but it's collaborating with new independent organizations like ProPublica, which are funding in-depth reports to fill in the gap and winning Pulitzers in the process.
Investigative reporting may be more important today than it ever has been. It drives original content on the internet, and we're all becoming much more internet-driven news organizations. And if you're looking for original content, there's nothing more original than investigative reporting.
Like every newspaper, the Post has tried to reinvent itself for the digital age, but it's missed opportunities along the way. 20 years ago, the paper's then managing editor, Bob Kaiser, devised a survival strategy that proved to be way before its time. He predicted that the internet would overtake print and urged the Post to lead the way.
Bob Kaiser's memo, written in '92, was extraordinary, visionary. I think you went back and looked at it today, you would say, wow, that guy got it. This is 20 years ago, right? The Post could have absolutely seized the mantle of, U.S. accountability journalism online, could have been a tremendous player.
4 decades ago, the Washington Post began on an investigative journey that would make journalistic history. The question today is where it goes from here.
The Post will be smaller in the future, but maybe nimbler and better able to compete. It just will not ever be the size it was, say, about 10 or 12 years ago.
It will always be there, I think. More probably in digital form, but I think we have still enough people in Washington who are committed to holding a newspaper in their hands.
The future of the Post will inevitably be less storied than its past. It's almost guaranteed. I mean, I don't think the people at the Washington Post woke up one day and they said, oh, we'd like to just have fewer journalists doing less impressive stories. Let's do it that way. I think that it was something that, because of the business pressures, that became an outcome that they are now grappling with and trying to save this great legacy.
More Global Village Voices now on the post-Watergate Washington Post.
What happened in 1972 could absolutely happen again today. The fact is, Washington, D.C. is still flooded with reporters covering every aspect of government and politics. On top of it, all the digital startups have created even more watchdogs.
Corporations no longer place the value on investigative journalism that they did 40 years ago. I recently had the opportunity to see David Simon, creator of The Wire and former journalist, speak. And he said that the corporations realized that they could produce a more mediocre product and cut their bottom line by sacrificing good investigative journalism and good journalism in general. And that is why you will probably not see any journalists today taking down a president.
We don't check the Post to see what's going on in Washington. We occasionally check in with the Post to see what they have to say about the stories that we're following on Twitter and Google+. The Post's credibility was probably damaged by its complicity in the WMD deception, but for me the paper is like the Peter Lorre character in Casablanca. He says to Rick, "Rick, you despise me, don't you?" Rick says, "If I gave you any thought, I probably would."
Finally, it's been a bit of an all-American media show this week, more by accident than design. We're reaching back with this next piece, going back about 45 years. Often, when we review predictions from the past of what the future would look like, they prove to be wildly off the mark and a good deal more utopian than things have actually turned out. But this next video is the exception. Recorded by American anchorman Walter Cronkite in 1967, it predicts with eerie precision how technology would change life in the 21st century, particularly when it comes to the workplace. If journalists were as good now at reporting the present as Cronkite was then at predicting the future, a media critique show like ours would probably be out of business. But they're not. So we'll see you next time at the Listening Post.
Now, this is where a man might spend most of his time in the home of the 21st century. This equipment here will allow him to carry on normal business activities without ever going to an office away from home. This console provides a summary of news relayed by satellite from all over the world. Now, to get a newspaper copy for permanent reference, I just turn this button, and out it comes. When I've finished catching up on the news, I might check the latest weather. This same screen can give me the latest report on the stocks I might own. A telephone is this instrument here, a mock-up of a possible future telephone. This would be the mouthpiece. Now, if I want to see the people I'm talking with, I just turn the button and there they are. Over here, as I work on this screen, I can keep in touch with other rooms of the house through a closed-circuit television system. With equipment like this in the home of the future, we may not have to go to work. The work would come to us. In the 21st century, it may be that no home will be complete without a computerized communications console.